Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. The pediatric wing of St. Michael's Hospital in Chicago carried a peculiar kind of silence. It wasn't the kind of hush that followed tragedy, nor the sterile quiet of routine. It was a silence thick with exhaustion, blinking monitors, and the soft rustle of nurses moving with practiced care. Among them, Emma moved as if she were made of light, the kind that didn't blind, but soothe. At 26, Emma had learned to read people by how they held their hands or blinked too fast. She had grown used to comforting without words, to smiling even when her own life ached in silence. That morning, she was kneeling by the bed of a little boy named Noah, tracing cartoons on the sheet with her finger, trying to distract him from the IV in his arm, and that's when she felt it. A presence, a pause, a gaze that pinned her from across the room. She turned slowly, cautiously, and her eyes locked with his. Julian stood by the doorway in a dark tailored suit that didn't belong anywhere near this worn-out ward. His coat draped across one arm, the other hand resting in his pocket. He observed her in a way that made time stretch and bend around them. It wasn't just curiosity. It was as if he recognized something in her, something he didn't expect. He had come unannounced, part of a discreet initiative to support public hospitals through his philanthropic branch, Sterling Foundation. Normally, he sent advisors or PR agents. But today, for reasons even he couldn't name, he decided to come in person, and now he couldn't look away. Emma stood up, her eyes never leaving his. There was no fear in her gaze, only confusion and something else. She smoothed the edge of her scrubs and walked toward him, her steps measured, graceful despite the fatigue that clung to her shoulders. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice low and even. Julian blinked, as if returning from a place far away. "I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't," she said, but her tone was different now, guarded, uncertain. "Are you with the foundation?" He nodded. "Sterling Enterprises. I'm Julian." Of course he was. Everyone in Chicago knew the name. The Sterling Empire touched everything. Banks, real estate, media, medicine. He was the man who made CEOs stutter, politicians flatter, and journalists tremble. And yet here he was, standing in front of her like a man unsure of his footing. "I'm Emma," she said simply. She didn't offer her hand. They stood in silence for a moment, long enough for her to notice the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flicked between her and the boy on the bed. She followed his gaze. "Noah," she explained, 8 years old, came in last night with a severe asthma attack. He's scared of needles, so I distract him with dinosaurs. Does it help?" "Only if I do the T-Rex voice." She gave a faint smile, surprised by her own willingness to share. He didn't smile back, but his eyes softened just a little. "You're good at what you do." She tilted her head. "You just saw me kneel beside a bed. That doesn't say much." "It says everything," he replied. And there it was, a flicker of warmth beneath the armor. Their conversation didn't last long. A nurse called Emma from the hallway, and she excused herself, but before leaving, she glanced at him again, and in that glance, something was exchanged, not names or roles or intentions, just something wordless, intriguing, unfinished. Later that day, Emma would think back to that moment and realize she had seen sadness in his eyes. Not the performative kind that powerful men sometimes wore in interviews. This was something buried, raw, like he had forgotten how to ask for help and didn't trust anyone who offered it. Julian, for his part, found himself pacing the marble floors of his penthouse hours later, replaying her voice in his mind. There had been nothing strategic about her, no agenda, no performance, just presence. And that, for a man whose life was filled with masks, was oddly disarming. The next morning, flowers arrived at the hospital, not the kind that shouted attention, but simple white lilies with a note that read, "Thank you for reminding me what kindness looks like." Emma nearly dropped the card when she read the signature. The nurses buzzed with whispers, teasing her with sly smiles and raised brows. She smiled, said nothing, and tucked the note into her locker. She told herself it didn't matter. But that night she dreamed of a man with tired eyes and too many secrets. A week later, Julian returned, not with a board of directors or a PR team, but alone. He asked for Emma. She found him in the courtyard garden, pacing by the fountain like someone who didn't know how to wait. "I'm not here for business," he said before she could speak. "No." She folded her arms. I wanted to talk to you away from nurses and little boys and hospital walls. She hesitated. Why? I don't know, he said, but I can't seem to stop thinking about the way you looked at me, like you saw through everything. She blinked. That wasn't my intention. I know. That's what scares me. They sat on a stone bench. She didn't ask about his world, and he didn't talk about it. Instead, he asked about her favorite books, her childhood dog, the one place she'd always wanted to go but never could. And for 2 hours they talked like two people who had forgotten who they were supposed to be. But just as she began to relax, to let herself believe in the ease between them, he checked his watch and stood. I have to go, he said, voice clipped. Of course, she stood too. He looked at her then, like he wanted to say something important and couldn't. So instead, he reached into his pocket, handed her a folded piece of paper, and left without another word. She opened it after he disappeared. A handwritten note, dinner tomorrow, Delapan, Noel P. M. I won't bring my world if you promise not to bring yours. And beneath it, an address. The restaurant was quiet, the kind of place hidden behind tall hedges and frosted glass, elegant, understated, and designed for discretion. Soft amber lights glowed overhead, casting gentle halos onto white linen tablecloths. A cello played somewhere in the background, its melody slow and mournful. Emma sat at a corner table, her hands folded in her lap, trying not to fidget. She had chosen a navy blue dress, modest, simple, something that belonged more in a church than in a place like this. And yet, as Julian walked in and spotted her across the room, his breath caught. She looked like she didn't belong, and somehow like she belonged more than anyone else. He crossed the floor with deliberate ease, dressed in a dark suit that looked like it cost more than her annual salary. But his presence wasn't just about wealth. It was command, control, quiet power. And yet when he reached her, all that seemed to soften. You came, he said, as if surprised she was real. She looked up, meeting his eyes. So did you? They smiled. Small, tentative smiles, and it was like no one else in the restaurant existed. The waiter appeared, bowed slightly, and poured sparkling water into tall glasses. Emma reached for hers and sipped, needing something to anchor her. Julian watched her, not in the way men often did, but as though he was trying to memorize her expression, trying to understand the language of her silences. I wasn't sure you would accept, he admitted. Neither was I, she replied. I almost didn't. What changed your mind? She hesitated. You looked lost that day at the hospital, like you were holding something heavy and pretending it wasn't there. He blinked, caught off guard. I didn't know it showed. It didn't. Not to most people. There was a beat of silence between them. Then he leaned back, folding his hands in front of him. Do you always speak like that? As if you see right through people, only when they're not trying so hard to hide. A chuckle escaped him. Low, genuine. God help me, he murmured. Dinner came and went with slow elegance. They talked, not about work or politics or anything that belonged to his world, but about childhood memories, favorite books, the sound of rain at night. Julian told her about the lake house his mother once took him to, before everything became about power and legacy. Emma shared how she learned to braid her own hair after her mom left, and how she used to make up lullabies for her little brother when their father forgot to come home. There was a softness in their voices, as if they both knew this night was something fragile. By the time dessert arrived, which neither of them touched, the distance between them had closed, not physically, but emotionally. Something had begun to form in that space, not just attraction, recognition. When they walked outside, the air was cool and damp. His car waited at the curb, engine purring softly. But they didn't part immediately. They stood on the sidewalk beneath the glow of an old street lamp, wrapped in quiet. Would it be inappropriate, he asked slowly, if I said I didn't want this night to end yet? She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting something unspoken. That depends on what you mean by end. He smiled faintly. Just not yet. Not goodbye. Maybe a walk. She nodded, and they walked slowly, without direction, like people who didn't want to be found. That night didn't end with a kiss. It didn't need to. It ended with a look, one that lingered just long enough to echo in their minds long after they had parted. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, but charged beneath. Julian sent no flowers this time, no public gestures. Instead, she received a handwritten note tucked into her locker. I'll be near the park bench where the sycamores lean. Friday, 7:30. She didn't tell anyone. They met again and again, always in places where no one would recognize them. Late-night diners, shadowed gardens, private libraries in the back of old buildings. Each meeting was a whisper, a stolen page from a book no one else could read. They talked about everything and nothing, and with each conversation, Julian became less of a distant figure and more of a man. He confessed his fear of becoming like his father, a man who built empires but left destruction in every room he exited. Emma, in return, told him about her fear of loving someone who could disappear at any moment, not just physically, but emotionally. "I don't disappear," he said once, voice tight. "You do," she whispered. "In your eyes." He didn't argue. He just looked away. But not all moments were heavy. There was laughter, two inside jokes that formed in glances, the way she would mock his obsession with black coffee, or how he teased her for always carrying two pens, one for work, one for dreams. One night, in an old theater no longer in service, he danced with her to music playing from his phone. She laughed when he stepped on her toes, and he laughed too, for the first time in years. There, in that dusted room, surrounded by broken seats and forgotten curtains, they felt alive in a way that no boardroom or hospital wing ever could offer. Still, they didn't name what was growing between them. There were no declarations, only eyes that said too much and touches that lingered too long. And then came the night at his office. She had come to drop off a thank you letter for a donation he'd made to a pediatric wing, in her name, anonymously, of course. He opened the door before she knocked, as if he had been waiting. Inside, the room was warm, dark, except for the city lights filtering through the tall windows. They talked for a moment, nothing urgent, but something shifted, a pause between words, a silence that stretched just a second too long. She took a step back, and he took a step forward. Their hands touched first, his fingers brushing hers, hesitant. Then their eyes met, and whatever restraint existed collapsed between them. The kiss was slow at first. A question formed in breath and skin, but then came the pull. Deep, magnetic, undeniable. His hands cradled her face like he was afraid she might vanish. Her body melted into his as though it had known the shape of him long before this night. They broke apart, breathless. "I shouldn't have," he started. "I know," she said, but neither of them moved away. And outside, beyond the glass, the city kept its secrets. It was never supposed to happen like that. They had met for a late dinner, this time in a private lounge inside one of Julian's buildings, a quiet place with velvet chairs and dim lamps that spilled amber light across mahogany floors. He had cooked, or tried to burnt pasta, undercooked vegetables. Emma had laughed so hard she nearly cried. And Julian, for once, looked completely out of control, human, soft. She cleaned the mess while he opened a bottle of wine. They sat on the floor instead of the table. Music played low, an old jazz tune humming like a secret in the background. "You're different when you're not trying to be perfect," she said, sipping slowly. He glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "Is that a compliment?" "It's the only kind I give." They were closer than they realized, knees brushing, shoulders tilted toward one another, the kind of closeness that doesn't announce itself but creeps in one heartbeat at a time. Her hand was resting on the floor between them, and without thinking, his fingers found hers. A silent intertwining. She didn't pull away. They didn't speak after that, not for a long time. Instead, he shifted toward her, slow, tentative. Like someone approaching a fire, his hand moved to her cheek, his thumb grazing the curve of her jaw as his eyes searched hers, asking a question he didn't know how to phrase. Her breath hitched, but she didn't look away. He leaned in, and then their lips met. Soft, searching, unfamiliar, but destined. It wasn't the kiss of a man used to getting what he wanted. It was the kiss of someone afraid he might never deserve it. And for Emma, it wasn't surrender, it was recognition. When they broke apart, her hands were trembling slightly. She closed her eyes, grounding herself in the feel of his palm still cradling her cheek. "You okay?" he whispered. She nodded. "Barely. I didn't expect you to feel like this." "Like what?" "Real. Un moment passed." Then he stood, reaching for her hand. "Come with me." He led her upstairs, not in haste, but in reverence. The elevator ride was silent, her fingers wrapped in his, her pulse racing. His penthouse office was nothing like she imagined. It was warm. Books lined the shelves, and there was a piano in the corner covered in dust. He dimmed the lights and opened the floor-to-ceiling windows, letting in the city sounds, distant sirens, honking horns, the endless hum of life below. "Stay," he said quietly. She stepped closer. "Are you sure?" "No," he admitted, "but I want to be." Their second kiss was deeper, filled with things they hadn't said. He lifted her gently, carrying her into a room that smelled faintly of cedar and linen. She laughed nervously when he bumped into the doorframe, and he smiled as he whispered, "Sorry," into her shoulder. There were no sharp movements, no rush, just hands learning each other's pace. He undressed her like someone unwrapping something fragile, not with lust, but with awe. Her skin responded to his touch, like it had waited for this permission, and when she stood in front of him, bare and exposed, she didn't feel ashamed. She felt seen. Julian's movements were slow, careful. He kissed the curve of her shoulder, her collarbone, her wrists. He memorized the way her breath caught when he touched the small of her back, the way she whispered his name, Jules, like a prayer she wasn't sure he'd answer. They lay down together, and the space between them vanished. No pretense, no titles, just skin, warmth, and emotion unspoken. They didn't make love out of desire. They made love out of longing. Longing to be known, to be held, to be chosen. And when it was over, or rather, when the waves finally calmed, they didn't speak. They just lay in the dark, heart still thundering, hands still searching, her head on his chest, his fingers drawing invisible shapes on her back. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said softly. "I did," he replied. "Not like this, but I knew the moment I saw you that I would ruin myself if it meant being close to you." She closed her eyes, tears slipping out before she could stop them. He didn't wipe them, he just held her tighter. In the days that followed, they existed in stolen hours. In quiet hotel rooms, country roads, the backseat of a car parked in silence. Every touch became a language, every goodbye a wound. One night in his country house in the Hamptons, they cooked dinner together and ended up feeding each other by the fireplace. Outside, snow began to fall, slow and silent. Inside, he knelt behind her, kissing her spine, tracing his name into her skin with nothing but breath. She whispered things she never told anyone. He listened like it mattered more than any boardroom deal. "I'm afraid of becoming invisible," she said. "You're the only thing I see." They made love again, not because of passion alone, but because being apart had become unbearable, and somewhere in those moments, something unexpected began to grow, a quiet shift, a life forming within her, but Emma didn't know yet. Not then. She only knew that something sacred had taken root, and deep inside her, a truth was waiting to be discovered, one that would change everything. The nights that followed blurred into one another like brushstrokes on a canvas too sacred to name. For Emma and Julian, time stopped obeying clocks. They existed between hospital shifts and boardroom meetings, between the clatter of the real world and the hush of their secret. Sometimes it was his penthouse in Manhattan, a sleek glass sanctuary above the noise. Other times it was the cottage in the Hamptons, hidden behind pine trees and drenched in moonlight. Wherever they were, the world outside grew smaller. What mattered was the way they looked at each other when no one else could see. One evening, as winter whispered at the windows, Emma stood barefoot in his kitchen, wearing nothing but one of his dress shirts and sipping peppermint tea. Julian watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame like a man trying to memorize her. The way her hair was messily tied up, the way her legs stretched toward the soft light, the curve of her spine as she leaned on the counter. "You always do that," she said without turning. "Do what?" "Look at me like I'm about to disappear." He walked toward her slowly, his voice a hush. "That's because every time you're near me, I start believing things I stopped believing a long time ago." She turned to face him, placing the mug on the counter. "Like what?" "Like maybe I'm not doomed to become my father, that maybe I can build something without destroying it." Her eyes softened. She reached up and touched his face, a simple gesture, but one that made his throat tighten. "I'm not asking you to be anyone else," she whispered. "Just don't push me away." That night, they didn't rush. He kissed her in the hallway, their shadows stretching long across the hardwood floor. His hands slid beneath the shirt she wore, memorizing her warmth, her rhythm, the rise and fall of her breath. They made love with the kind of slowness that only comes when two people are no longer hiding. There was reverence in every movement. Julian traced her collarbone with his lips like it was scripture. Emma explored his chest with trembling fingers, not out of fear, but discovery. She whispered his name, Jules, and he closed his eyes as if the sound healed something in him. Later, lying in bed, tangled in the quiet, she asked, "Do you ever feel like we're living outside of time?" He looked at her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "All the time." In the days that followed, their connection deepened, not just in passion, but in presence. They shared silences that didn't demand to be filled, laughter that rose suddenly and without explanation, moments when they'd sit across from each other, saying nothing, yet feeling completely understood. At the country house, the air smelled of pine and firewood. Julian lit the fireplace and laid thick blankets over the worn leather sofa. They shared wine and stories from their pasts, the things they never told anyone else. Emma confessed how, as a child, she used to fall asleep to the sound of her mother crying in the next room, how she would hum to herself just to drown it out. Julian told her how he used to sit in his father's office late at night, pretending to read contracts he didn't understand, just to feel close to him, even in silence. "So, you don't have to carry all of that," she said, tracing his knuckles with her thumb. "I don't know how to put it down. You're doing it now." And maybe he was, because that night, when they undressed each other again, it wasn't about escape. It was about being seen, being chosen, being held without question. She kissed the scar beneath his ribs and asked nothing. He ran his fingers down her spine and didn't flinch when she whispered her fears. There was no performance, just surrender. They lay in the quiet afterward, the fire crackling beside them. He pulled her into his chest, his chin resting on her head, and for the first time in years, he slept without dreams. But something unspoken had begun to shift. One morning, Emma stood at the bathroom sink, brushing her teeth, when she caught her reflection. Pale skin, darker circles under her eyes, a tension in her lower belly she couldn't quite place. She blinked it away, told herself it was nothing, just fatigue, just long hours and long nights. But a part of her knew somewhere beneath the surface. Her body had already begun to whisper a new story. She didn't say anything, not yet. Instead, she curled back into bed, slid beneath the sheets, and tucked herself into his side. He stirred but didn't wake, his arm instinctively wrapping around her. She listened to the sound of his breath and wondered what would happen when she finally told him. Would he panic? Would he pull away? Or would he do what she silently hoped for and choose her again? That evening, they stood by the window of the penthouse, watching the lights of the city flicker like distant stars. Emma leaned into him, her fingers laced with his. "Have you ever wanted to disappear?" she asked softly. He looked down at her, surprised. "Why would you ask that?" "I don't know. Sometimes I just wonder what it would feel like to live a life no one notices." "You'd hate it," he said, "because the world would be missing something it doesn't even know it needs." She smiled faintly, resting her head against his chest. He kissed her hair. Neither of them knew that their world was already changing, that within her a heartbeat had begun, fragile, hidden, but undeniable, and soon no secret would stay hidden. It began with a scent. Emma stood in the hospital supply room, organizing vials of antibiotics, when the smell of rubbing alcohol hit her harder than usual. Her stomach twisted. A wave of nausea rolled up her throat, sharp and unexpected. She clutched the shelf for balance, closing her eyes, breathing through her nose. "You okay?" asked a colleague, poking her head in. "Yeah." Emma forced a smile. "Skipped breakfast." But it wasn't just that. Over the next few days, small things began to unravel. Food she normally loved suddenly repulsed her. Her body felt heavier, not in weight, but in gravity, like something had quietly shifted inside her. And then came the moment she couldn't ignore. She was late by a week. She tried to stay logical. Stress, irregular shifts, emotional exhaustion. They could all throw her cycle off, but deep down, she knew her body. And her body was telling her something had taken root. At the pharmacy down the street from the hospital, she paid in cash, kept her head down, and walked back home with trembling hands. She didn't even wait to change out of her scrubs. The test sat on the edge of the bathroom sink as she stared at it, frozen in place, pulse roaring in her ears. 2 pink lines. Emma sank onto the cold tile floor, the test clutched in her hand. Her heart thundered, not in fear, but in something much more complicated, a storm of wonder and disbelief. Her fingers pressed against her belly, still flat, still quiet, but suddenly sacred. A child. His child. The world didn't stop moving. She still went to work, still responded to emergencies, still smiled at elderly patients, and wrapped tiny arms in bandages, but everything felt different, like she was living in 2 layers, the one everyone could see and the one only she could feel. She didn't tell Julian right away. At first, she convinced herself she needed time to process. Then she reasoned that he was busy, locked in high-stakes negotiations, media appearances, global investors, but in truth, she was afraid not of him, of what the truth might mean for their quiet world. For them, he had never spoken of children. He barely spoke of the future. And yet, every time he looked at her lately, there was a softness there, a question he hadn't yet formed, a vulnerability she didn't want to wound. The decision tore at her in silence. Then, one Sunday evening, the answer arrived in a different form. She was in his apartment, curled up on the window seat, sipping ginger tea, and pretending to read a book. Julian sat at the piano behind her, fingers gliding over the keys with surprising ease. He wasn't playing anything recognizable, just fragments, notes that rose and fell like breath. When the music faded, he turned toward her. "You've been quiet." She looked over her shoulder, startled by the way he was watching her. "Just tired," she said, "more than usual." She hesitated. "You notice that?" "I notice everything about you." Her heart skipped. He stood, walked over, and sat beside her on the cushioned bench. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "You've been pulling away from me." Her throat tightened. "I'm not." "You are." His voice wasn't angry. It was wounded. "And I don't know why." Emma closed the book in her lap and stared at her hands. Then, before fear could stop her, she reached into her bag and pulled out the folded paper. The second test, still sealed, still unspoken. She handed it to him, without a word. Julian looked at her, then down at the object in his hands. His fingers were steady as he unfolded it. The moment he saw it, the meaning of those two pink lines, something shifted in his expression. Not panic, not anger, stillness. Like the moment before thunder, he didn't speak right away, just stared at it, then back at her. "You're sure?" he asked, voice hushed. She nodded, eyes wet. "I took two. I didn't believe it either." Julian stood, paced to the other side of the room, ran a hand through his hair. "A child, our child," she whispered. He turned slowly, as if the words had struck him physically. A long silence stretched between them, the kind that carries the weight of every choice yet to be made. Then he crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt in front of her. He didn't say anything at first. He just placed his hand on her stomach gently, reverently, like touching something sacred. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, biting back a sob. He looked up at her. "I don't know how to do this." "I don't either. I've never. I mean, I didn't grow up with examples of how to love someone the right way. I'm not asking for perfect," she whispered. "I just need to know you won't disappear." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something different there. Not just desire or admiration, but fear and wonder tangled together. "I won't run," he said finally. "Whatever this is, however it looks, I'm in it all the way." Emma exhaled, the breath shaking from her chest. He pulled her into him, holding her like she might break. And maybe in that moment, they both did. Just a little broke open, broke honest. They stood there in the quiet, wrapped in each other, while the city lights blinked behind them like tiny promises. Neither of them noticed the phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. A message, a name, a headline already beginning to take shape. Because outside their fragile bubble, the world had begun to whisper, and soon it would scream. It had been 3 days since Emma had handed him the test. And Julian still hadn't told anyone, no staff, no lawyers, no advisors. The world outside kept moving. Stock prices fluctuated, headlines rolled, but inside his penthouse, time had stilled. He spent hours pacing the floor, fingers raking through his hair, mind spinning through possibilities he'd never had to consider before. A child, his child. Everything in his world was built on control, iron contracts, boardroom dominance, polished press releases, but this was a heartbeat he couldn't manage or manipulate. It didn't come with a strategy. It came with vulnerability, and Emma, he watched her from across the room as she poured water into a glass, unaware that he was studying her. She had a glow about her lately, not cliché, not magical. Just a deeper stillness in the way she moved. Like her body already knew it was protecting something precious. "Sit with me," he said softly. She looked up, surprised. "Now?" He nodded, already sinking into the leather armchair near the fireplace. She came, barefoot, wearing one of his shirts again, and it undid him every time. When she sat across from him, her hands folded nervously, he didn't speak at first, just stared into the fire. "I've never told you this," he began. "But I was an only child. My father had 2 families. I was the one he claimed publicly, but not the one he loved." Emma's brows pulled together. She leaned forward. "Jules," she said softly, "I swore I'd never become like him. I spent my entire life proving I wasn't him. Every decision, every risk, every ounce of success, all to distance myself from his shadow. He turned to face her fully, and now, the one thing he failed to do becomes the one thing I must learn how to do from scratch. She reached across and took his hand. You don't have to be your father, but I'm afraid I already am. I don't know how to be soft with something I can't control. I don't know how to build a family when I've never seen one that didn't fall apart. You start by staying, that's it. Not planning, not perfecting, just staying. He nodded slowly. I want to. I really do. Then that's enough for now. There was a long pause. The fire crackled. A distant siren moaned from the street below, and then he asked, "Have you told anyone?" "No, only you." He let out a breath, part relief, part dread. "Good," he said, "because I need time to figure out how to protect you before this gets out." She nodded, but there was something in her expression he didn't see, something unsaid, because Emma had received a message that morning from a blocked number, a single line. "Does Julian know about the baby yet?" No name, no source, but she knew what it meant. Someone knew. 2 days later, it happened. It started with a headline buried on a gossip site. Mystery woman seen at Sterling penthouse multiple nights. Then the next day, insider claims CEO's secret lover might be expecting. Emma saw the post during her lunch break. Her hands trembled so violently she dropped her phone. Her face went cold. By the time she picked it up again, the comments had already started. Gold digger. Classic scandal. Nurse seduce billionaire. Watch her sell the baby story for million. She couldn't breathe. The hospital hadn't said anything yet, but the stares had begun the way. Nurses lowered their voices when she entered the room. The way one doctor glanced at her belly, then looked away. She didn't even finish her shift. She just left. Julian was in a meeting when she stormed into the building. No security guard stopped her. They knew her by now. She stepped into the elevator and rode to the top floor with tears she refused to let fall. When he saw her, he stood immediately. "Emma." Someone leaked it. His face froze. She threw her phone onto his desk. They know. Everyone knows. It's starting already, the comments. The looks. The whispers. They're calling me. Her voice cracked. Calling me a trap. A scandal. He stepped toward her. But she flinched. "You said you'd protect me. You said we had time. I didn't know." "Didn't know what, Jules?" "That someone in your perfect little empire would betray you. Or that maybe, just maybe, our world was never going to survive your world." His jaw clenched. "I'll fix it." "No, don't fix it. Feel it. For once in your life, stop calculating and just feel it." He stepped back, as if her words physically struck him. She wiped her eyes quickly. "I don't want to disappear into your silence. If you're going to love me, you have to love all of this, the mess, the fear, the risk. Me." He swallowed hard. His chest rose and fell with a weight she couldn't see. Then he whispered, "I do love you." The room went still. She stared at him. "Then say it like you mean it. Not like a business deal. Not like an apology." He walked to her slowly, deliberately. "I love you." Her eyes welled up. "I love you," he repeated. "And I love what we've made. Even if I don't know how to be what you need yet, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She let herself fall into him then, sobbing against his chest, fists pressed to his shirt like she needed to anchor herself. And for the first time, Julian didn't try to fix her pain. He simply held it. But far below their world of glass and silence, cameras had begun to flash, and somewhere in a conference room filled with men in suits and smiles that hid knives, a conversation had already begun about damage control, about reputation, about denial. Because love was never part of the business plan, it started with a headline on a business tabloid. Julian Sterling's secret mistress, nurse from Chicago, allegedly pregnant with heir. Then came the photos, grainy but unmistakable. Emma leaving his building late at night, her coat clutched tightly around her, her face partially hidden beneath a scarf. Another image showed her entering the hospital, visibly distressed. A third, crueler one, captured her standing on the sidewalk, her hand resting on her abdomen, a candid moment twisted into tabloid bait. The news spread like wildfire. By midday, her name was trending. By nightfall, her hospital suspended her with the excuse of investigating internal policy violations. The press called her everything from the nurse who seduced a billionaire to the woman destroying Sterling Enterprises. Talk shows speculated whether she had intentionally gotten pregnant. Blogger dissected her past. Old social media posts resurfaced and were taken out of context. Her modest apartment was swarmed by photographers. A drone hovered outside her kitchen window. She couldn't go outside without being followed. couldn't check her phone without seeing her name twisted into headlines. She didn't recognize. And Julian. He had promised to protect her, but he was silent, too silent. Emma sat on the bathroom floor of the penthouse, curled up near the tub, her phone vibrating endlessly beside her. She hadn't answered a call in hours. She couldn't. The noise was too loud, not just outside, but inside her. Her body felt tense, her chest tight. The weight of the baby she carried suddenly felt heavier. Not physically, but spiritually. She pressed her palm to her belly and whispered, "I'm sorry," again and again. The worst part wasn't the articles. It was the comments. "How much do you think she got paid to keep it?" "Another woman trying to trap." "A rich man. Hope he demands a paternity test." They didn't know her. They didn't know him, but in the world of public perception, truth was the first casualty. Meanwhile, across the city, Julian sat in a dark conference room surrounded by executives, men in suits, women with tight smiles, legal teams, PR handlers, investors who spoke in percentages and risk analysis. As if this living, breathing crisis was nothing but a glitch in the algorithm. "You need to issue a denial," one advisor said immediately. "We've drafted a press release." Added another, "You'll say the woman is lying, that you never had a personal relationship with her." Julian didn't speak. The room waited. Then one man leaned forward, voice colder than the rest. "If you acknowledge this child publicly, you're opening yourself up to legal exposure, stockholder panic, and possibly a hostile board takeover. We need you to understand the gravity of this situation." Julian's jaw tightened. "So, you want me to lie?" The man didn't flinch. "We want you to protect what you've built." Julian looked down at the file in front of him. A blurry photo of Emma, a printed copy of the article, her name circled in red ink like a threat. He stood. "This meeting is over." "Julian, I said it's over." He left without another word. That night, Emma didn't sleep. She paced the apartment for hours, every creak of the floorboards echoing her restlessness. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She shut it off. At 3:17 a.m., she heard the key turn in the door. Julian entered, his face pale, his eyes hollow. She didn't wait. "Where have you been?" "Meetings. Meetings," she repeated. "While my life was torn apart, I'm trying to fix it." "Emma, you're trying to protect your name," she said sharply. "Not me. Not us." He stepped closer. "That's not true." "Then where were you when the media came for me? When the hospital suspended me? When I stood on the sidewalk sobbing because I didn't know if I could even buy groceries without being followed?" His lips parted, but no words came. Her voice cracked. "You promised to protect me. I didn't know it would happen so fast. You didn't know it would be real," she said, trembling. "But this is real. I am real. And your silence? It's louder than the headlines." He stepped forward, his voice breaking. "I thought staying quiet would shield you, that it would make it go away." "Did it?" she asked bitterly. "Because I've never felt more exposed." There was a pause, long and aching. Then she said something that made him flinch. "I don't know who I'm more afraid of right now, the world outside or you." He looked shattered, but she wasn't finished. "I love you," she whispered, "but I won't raise this child hiding behind your curtains. I won't be a secret. Not for your empire, not for your shareholders, not even for you." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks as she walked to the bedroom and shut the door, not with a slam, but with the kind of quiet that meant something had broken. The next morning, the media doubled down. Julian Sterling refuses to comment. Is silence an admission? Nurse disappears from public eye. Where is she now? Another headline suggested she had fled the country. Another claimed she was suing him for millions. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter, and for the first time Emma felt something she hadn't felt in months. Alone. On the 42nd floor of Sterling Enterprises, Julian stood at his office window, staring down at a city he no longer recognized. His phone rang, and he didn't answer. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, someone cold, brilliant, and empty. He touched the spot on the window where the rain streaked down the glass. Then, quietly, he whispered to the empty room, "What have I done?" Behind him, the office door creaked open. "Sir," his assistant said gently, "the press conference has been scheduled." He turned slowly. Press conference? He hadn't approved that. But the machine had already started moving without him. And now he'd have to decide. Protect his world, or protect the woman who had become it. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like fog rolling in through a cracked window, soft, invisible, but suffocating. Emma stayed in the guest bedroom, not because she was angry, but because she no longer knew where she belonged. The master bed smelled like him, like cinnamon and leather and all the things that once made her feel safe. Now it felt like a museum of unspoken things. Julian didn't ask her to return. He didn't ask anything at all. Their conversations shrank to logistics. "Are you eating?" "Yes. I'll be out late." "Okay. Doctor's appointment next Thursday." That was all. "No, I miss you." "No, I'm sorry." "No, I love you." Emma moved through the penthouse like a ghost, invisible but still aching. She found herself staring at the sonogram tucked inside her drawer, the one where a tiny shape was beginning to form, and wondering how something so alive could grow inside so much silence. Sometimes, in the early morning hours, when the city was still asleep, she'd feel the softest flutter in her abdomen, not a kick, not yet, just a whisper of movement, as if the child inside her was asking, "Are we going to be okay?" And she didn't know how to answer. Julian buried himself in work. He arrived early, left late, took calls at night. He barely touched his piano, barely touched her. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he didn't know how to bridge the space between them anymore. He had built his entire life around power, knowing the right thing to say, when to say it, and how to spin it into strength. But with Emma, every word he didn't speak became a wall. Every look avoided a brick in the distance growing between them. He'd stand outside her door sometimes, hand raised to knock, but he never did. One evening, she stood on the balcony, wrapped in a knit blanket, staring out at the skyline. The wind brushed her hair into her face, and the lights of Manhattan blinked like distant planets. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of a door. He stepped out, said nothing, stood beside her. She didn't look at him, but she asked, "Do you ever think about what kind of father you'll be?" He hesitated. "Every day, and I'm terrified." She nodded. "Me too." Silence again, but this time heavier, loaded with things unsaid. She turned toward him. "Do you still want this? Me? The baby? This life?" His eyes flicked to hers, but he didn't answer. And that said everything. 2 days later, she packed a small bag, just clothes, vitamins, a few books. When he came home, she was in the hallway, coat on, her hand gripping the handle of her suitcase. His heart stopped. "Where are you going?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "I need space." He stepped forward. "Emma, I'm not leaving you. I'm leaving this silence, this prison you're building around us." He looked pained. "I didn't mean to." "I know," she said, "but meaning well doesn't stop the bleeding." He reached out, and for a moment she let him touch her, his hand on her cheek, her breath caught in her throat. "I still love you," he said. "I know," she replied. Then, gently, she pulled away and left. She moved into a modest apartment on the other side of the city. A friend from the hospital offered the spare room. It was smaller, older, with creaky floors and faded walls, but it had light, plants, windows that opened. It smelled of rosemary and coffee and air that didn't carry the weight of disappointment. Emma started prenatal yoga, walked every morning, cooked her own meals, but the ache inside her didn't leave. She missed him. Not the empire, not the name, him. The man who once kissed her forehead after midnight and whispered that she was the only thing in his life that ever made sense. Where had that man gone? And did he even know how to find her anymore? Julian kept the penthouse dark most nights. He tried to reach out once, a message, 4 words. "Are you sleeping okay?" She read it, didn't respond. He never sent another. His team urged him to speak publicly, issue a statement, apologize to the board, clarify his position. But he refused because the only apology that mattered wasn't to shareholders or press outlets. It was to the woman who now walked the city with his child inside her and tears still fresh on her cheeks. One afternoon, as winter melted into a fragile spring, Emma sat in a small clinic waiting room for a routine checkup. The walls were painted with murals of stars and clouds. She sat quietly, hand resting on her growing belly. A little girl sat across from her, swinging her legs, clutching a worn-out bunny. She smiled at Emma and asked, "Are you having a girl or a boy?" "I don't know yet." Emma replied with a soft laugh. "Do you think they'll like bunnies?" "I hope so." The little girl nodded solemnly. "My bunny helps me sleep when I'm sad." Emma's throat tightened. "Maybe your baby will need one, too," the girl added. "Maybe," Emma whispered, tears burning behind her eyes, because for the first time in weeks, she realized something terrifying. She didn't just feel alone, she felt forgotten. That night, She opened her journal and wrote a single line. I don't know if we're still waiting for each other or if we're both just letting go. She closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and curled into herself as the city breathed on without them. But across town, in a penthouse now dim and silent, Julian sat at his piano. His fingers hovered over the keys, and then, for the first time in weeks, he played not a love song, not a melody of hope, but a quiet elegy for something he wasn't ready to lose and didn't know how to keep. The boardroom was colder than usual. Julian sat at the head of the long obsidian table, fingers laced tightly, jaw clenched. Around him were the same faces he'd grown accustomed to over the years. Men in tailored suits, women in heels that echoed on polished floors, all of them masters of veiled threats and polite ultimatums. The screens at the far end displayed graphs, headlines, and plummeting shares. Sterling Enterprises was bleeding because of her. Because of him. Because of the truth that no one wanted to speak out loud. An executive cleared his throat. You have 72 hours to issue a public statement denying the paternity. If you don't, our investors will start pulling out. You know this. Another voice followed. We've arranged a press conference. You simply have to read what's written. It doesn't have to be aggressive, just enough to cast doubt. Once that's done, a third added, we'll begin recovery strategy. We'll manage the narrative. Julian said nothing. His silence was no longer misunderstood. It was feared. They continued anyway. You'll keep your position. We'll minimize the PR damage. But only if you cooperate. Only if you lie. Only if you erase her. He rose from his chair slowly and walked out, not a word, not a glance back. Outside, the city pulsed with rain. He stepped into the back of the black car waiting for him, the leather seats cold beneath him. His assistant sat in front, her phone buzzing nonstop. She turned slightly. Sir, you have a message from Emma. He looked up, his heart caught. She hadn't reached out in weeks. He took the phone with a hand that trembled more than he wanted to admit. It was a voice message, just 8 seconds long. He tapped play. I didn't call to fight. I miss you, and I'm scared. I can't do this alone. He closed his eyes. The car kept moving, but everything inside him stopped. Meanwhile, across the city, Emma sat on the edge of her bed, one hand on her belly, the other still clutching her phone. She hadn't expected him to answer. She hadn't even expected herself to speak. But the weight had become too much, and her heart, once so strong, was tired. Her baby kicked for the first time, and she gasped. Tears filled her eyes, not from pain, from longing, because the person she wanted to tell most was drifting further away by the day. Julian stood in the middle of his office. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched in every direction, powerful, endless, built by hands like his. But inside, he was still the boy sitting alone in a hallway, waiting for a father who never showed up. The difference was, now he had the chance to become something different, to choose love over legacy. And he had no idea how. The next morning, his lawyers waited for a final answer. The PR team had prepared everything. Cameras were being installed. A carefully worded statement was loaded on the teleprompter. All Julian had to do was show up. Instead, he was staring at the mirror, tying his tie, loosening it, tying it again. He had never looked more polished or more lost. At 10 o'clock a.m., reporters gathered. Lights flashed. Microphones clicked into place. The press conference room was filled to capacity. But the podium remained empty. 10, no Julian. 10, whispers, phones buzzing, panic in the eyes of his staff. And then a message appeared on the newswire. Julian Sterling cancels appearance. Statement forthcoming at 10:12 a.m. Emma opened her door. Julian stood there, rain on his coat, breath shaky. Tie gone. She stared at him for a long, aching moment. Why are you here? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single folded piece of paper, the statement he was supposed to read. He tore it in half, then into quarters, let the pieces fall between them. I couldn't do it, he said softly. I couldn't lie. Not about you. Not about him. Emma's lips parted. Him? He stepped forward, hands trembling slightly. I've been choosing power my entire life, but power never held me when I couldn't breathe. Power never said my name like it meant something. You did. Her eyes filled. I choose you, Emma. I choose our child, even if it costs me everything. She stared at him, the anger, the hurt, the love, all of it rising to the surface at once. He reached out, barely touching her hand. I'm scared, he whispered. So am I, she said, But maybe we don't have to do this, scared and alone. He pulled her into his arms, held her like she was the only truth left in a world full of noise. And in that moment, the future wasn't certain. But the choice was. Back at Sterling Enterprises, chaos unfolded. Stocks dropped, papers blared betrayal. The board panicked. But Julian wasn't there to hear it because, for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he needed to be. The world expected silence, or a denial, or a carefully crafted distraction to redirect attention back to numbers, not names. That's how Sterling Enterprises had always operated, with precision, detachment, and control. But that morning, everything changed. Julian stood behind a podium in a packed press room. Cameras lined every angle. Microphones crowded before him, like mouths hungry for scandal. The air was electric, not with anticipation, but with tension. Something was about to shift, and no one knew in which direction. He wasn't wearing a tie. His sleeves were rolled. His eyes, dark with fatigue, held something deeper than strategy. Conviction. He cleared his throat. Then he spoke. "No script today," he began. Voice low, steady, just truth. A ripple moved through the room. He paused, glanced briefly at the front row reporters, critics, shareholders, adversaries, and then he looked directly into the camera. "There's been a lot of speculation lately about my personal life, about a woman, a child, about whether or not I have a future outside of this company." Another pause. "I'm here to confirm one thing. It's all true." Gasps, audible. It continued. "Her name is Emma Grace. She is not a scandal. She is not a mistake. She is not a threat to this company or to me. She is the woman I love." He let the words settle, and then, "We are expecting a child." Flashes exploded across the room. Julian didn't flinch. "I understand this isn't what people expect from a man in my position, but maybe that's the problem. We've spent too long hiding behind polished images and statements written by people who've never tasted fear or joy or vulnerability." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I've built an empire, yes, but I've also built walls, and for the first time in my life, someone saw past them, not to what I could offer, but to who I actually am. Broken, flawed, but willing to fight." The room was breathless. "I am stepping down as CEO of Sterling Enterprises, effective immediately, not because I'm ashamed, but because I want to live a life I don't have to hide from." He exhaled. "I want to be a father, a real one. I want to build something with my own hands that doesn't have a stock ticker attached to it." He took a step back from the podium, looked directly at the lens again. "Emma, if you're watching this, I choose us publicly, proudly, forever." And with that, he left the stage. No questions, no rehearsed answers, just the echo of truth in a room that had forgotten how to recognize it. Emma stood frozen in front of the television. The news alert had lit up her phone. She had turned it on out of curiosity, expecting another cold press release, another wave of damage control. But then there he was, his voice, his eyes, his words. She stood in her small kitchen, hands over her mouth, tears falling freely. The baby kicked again, not a flutter this time, but a press, as if agreeing, as if saying, "I heard him too, Mom." She cried and laughed and dropped to her knees, overwhelmed, because she had hoped. But she never expected not this, not him, not everything. The country exploded. Half applauded his honesty, half criticized the recklessness. The board was furious. The shareholders panicked. But the people, the ordinary ones, saw something else. A man letting go of power for something real. A man not running from consequences, but toward love. Interviews flooded in. Headlines changed tone. CEO chooses love over legacy. The billionaire who said no to the script. Is this the end of Sterling Enterprises or the start of something more? But Julian didn't answer any of them. He didn't go on talk shows. He didn't write a memoir. He went home to her. He arrived at Emma's apartment the next day. No cameras, no entourage, just him. This time, when she opened the door, she didn't look at him with suspicion or fear. She looked at him like he was the answer to a prayer she never dared to say out loud. He stepped inside quietly. She stared for a moment, her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. Then she whispered, "You meant it." He nodded. Every word. She walked to him slowly, tears filling her lashes again. "I don't know what happens next," she said honestly. "Neither do I," he whispered. "But I want to find out with you." He lowered to his knees, pressed his forehead gently against her belly, closed his eyes. "I'm sorry for the silence," he said, "for the fear. For all the ways I failed you." She placed her hands over his, "And I'm sorry I walked away without letting you catch up." He looked up at her. "I'm caught up now," and she smiled. Because he was. Finally, they sat on the couch later that night. No plans, no strategies. Just space between them that felt like a beginning. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. She blinked. He opened it. A ring. Simple, elegant, timeless. "I'm not asking for perfect," he said, echoing her own words back to her. "Just a life where we don't hide anymore." Her breath caught, and in a whisper filled with all the quiet yeses her heart had held back, she said, "Okay." Outside, the city carried on horns, voices, headlines, chaos, but inside that little apartment, something powerful had happened. Not a scandal, not a press strategy, but a decision to love without fear, to begin again together, and far above the noise, where boardrooms once ruled and power reigned, a throne stood empty, and a heart, once walled off by legacy, had finally learned to open. Spring didn't return all at once. It crept back in gently, like a second chance whispered into the soil. In the Colorado Valley, where the wind moved without hurry and the night smelled of pine and wood smoke, a quiet farmhouse came alive again, not with luxury, but with warmth, and inside it, a new life was beginning, not just for the child sleeping in the nursery, but for the two souls who had walked through fire just to find each other again. Julian had traded skyscrapers for open skies. His days no longer began with meetings or headlines, but with the soft, unmistakable cries of a newborn from down the hall. And every time he heard it, that fragile, fierce call, he would rise without hesitation. His steps were slower now, grounded. His hands, once known for signatures and contracts, had learned gentleness, the kind that only fathers discover in the dark, with a bottle in one hand and a sleeping child in the other. Elias James Sterling had been born beneath soft hospital lights. With Emma gripping Julian's hand so tightly, he thought she might never let go, and he hadn't wanted her to. The moment Elias let out his first cry, Julian had broken not with fear, but with wonder. He had held him for hours, whispering apologies into the boy's hair, not for what had been, but for everything that would never touch him. Not shame, not silence, not absence, only presence, only love. The farmhouse became their sanctuary. Its paint was chipped, the plumbing needed work, but the walls held stories now, real ones. Not boardroom victories or business legacies, but the kind told through baby laughter and kitchen dancing at midnight. Julian chopped wood in the mornings and learned how to brew strong coffee. He walked barefoot across the creaky floors and planted herbs with Emma in the garden, his hands dirty in ways that made him feel clean. At night, he would write not reports, not speeches, but letters to Elias, a collection of pages he planned to give him one day, when he was old enough to understand that his father hadn't always been the man who tucked him in, and that love sometimes takes time to learn. Emma, too, changed. She went back to nursing part-time at a local community clinic. Patients greeted her by name. Children waved when they saw her in town. And though she was still known as the woman from the news, no one treated her like a headline. She was simply Emma, now mother, healer, wife in all but name. In the evenings, she read aloud while Julian folded laundry. Sometimes they fell asleep on the couch with Elias between them, his tiny hands gripping their shirts like anchors to a life they never dreamed they'd deserve. They shared long walks under the stars, whispered plans for a garden expansion, and kissed in the doorway like teenagers learning each other's mouths for the first time. It was ordinary, and it was perfect, but healing isn't a straight road. There were hard nights, nights when Elias wouldn't sleep, and both were too tired to speak without sharpness, nights when Julian woke from nightmares, his father's voice echoing in his mind, warning him he'd fail just the same. On those nights, Emma would hold him not with words, but with silence and skin, her palm pressed to his chest until the storm inside him quieted, and sometimes she would cry too, not from sadness, but from the weight of joy, from the disbelief that this peace, this love, had chosen her after all the years she thought it never would. They didn't aim for perfection. They aimed for presence, and they never stopped choosing each other. One afternoon, as golden light spilled across the porch, Julian sat with Elias sleeping on his chest. He rocked slowly, one hand resting protectively over his son's back, the other tracing idle circles on the armrest. Emma stepped outside, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She didn't speak, she just sat beside them. After a long moment, she whispered, "Do you ever miss it? The city, the empire, the name, the power." He looked out at the hills, took a breath. I miss who I thought I was supposed to be, but not who I actually was." She nodded, and that was enough. They hung new photos on the walls, not magazine covers or company awards, but snapshots of a life in progress. Emma barefoot in the garden, Julian napping with Elias in a hammock, flour on their noses in the kitchen, crayon scribbles on the fridge. Their story now told in color. On Elias's 3-month milestone, they invited no one, no press, no spectacle. Just the three of them in the yard. A candle on a cupcake, laughter carried by the breeze. Julian lifted Elias in his arms, kissing his cheek. "You, little man," he said, "changed everything." And Emma, watching from the doorway, whispered, "And everything changed us." That night, as they tucked Elias into bed and watched him drift into dreams, Julian took Emma's hand and led her outside. Under a sky full of stars, he pulled something from his pocket. A ring. Simple, quiet, golden, like the life they had created. He didn't kneel. He didn't need to. "I know this life is already ours," he said softly, "but I want to promise it again, with your name beside mine, with no more curtains, no more waiting." Her eyes shimmered. "You were always the promise," she whispered. "Yes." Later, as they danced barefoot on the porch to a song only they could hear, Julian pressed his forehead to hers and said, This is everything I never knew, I was allowed to want," and she smiled, because it was. The chapel stood at the end of a gravel road, tucked between willow trees and a narrow stream that shimmered under the late afternoon sun. It wasn't grand, it wasn't gilded in gold or carved from marble, but it was honest, like them. It smelled of cedar and wildflowers. The pews were worn, the floor creaked in protest with every step, and yet, when Emma stepped through the doorway, white lace trailing behind her, everything fell silent, not from protocol, but reverence. Julian stood at the altar in a navy suit. No tie, no crowd, just a quiet smile that trembled slightly when he saw her. He had seen her 100 ways under candlelight, in hospital scrubs, curled up on a couch with their son sleeping against her chest. But today, something inside him broke, in the best way, because this wasn't a dream, it was real. And she was walking toward him like a promise finally kept. The guest list was short, just a handful of souls who had seen them through the storm. A retired nurse who had once mentored Emma, a former driver who Abierto now ran a bookstore, and the midwife who had whispered encouragement into Emma's ear when Elias came into the world. Elias was there too, of course, cradled in the arms of a close friend, his tiny bow tie slightly crooked, his face soft with sleep. He didn't cry, not once, as if he, too, understood that something sacred was unfolding. The ceremony began with no music, only words, vows written in ink-stained notebooks, spoken with voices that sometimes faltered but never strayed. Julian took Emma's hands in his and whispered, "I once built a kingdom of silence, cold rooms, empty floors, my name on buildings but not on hearts. And then you came in not to rescue me, but to remind me that I was worth being found." Her eyes shone, tears balanced but unfallen. "You didn't save me," he continued, voice breaking. "You saw me, all the cracks, all the unfinished pieces, and still you stayed. You chose me again and again." He pressed her fingers to his lips, "And I promised to do the same for all the years to come." Then it was her turn. Emma looked up at him, her voice soft but unwavering. "I thought love would feel like thunder, like lightning. But you were the quiet after the storm, the calm I never thought I deserved." She took a breath. "I've watched you become the man you always were beneath the fear. I've seen you with our son, not perfect, but present, and that is the love I will always choose." She smiled, hand over his heart. "Even in silence, even in uncertainty, I am yours." The rings were plain, no diamonds, no spectacle, just gold. Solid. Enduring. Like them. When the final words were spoken and they were told they could kiss, Julian didn't hesitate. He cupped her face like he had 1,000 times before, but this time with everything behind them and everything ahead. Their lips met, and the world faded. The celebration was held under the open sky, with string lights hung between trees and long wooden tables dressed in linen and rosemary. There was no orchestra, just a record player spinning old love songs as twilight bloomed around them. They danced barefoot in the grass, laughter and light in their steps. Emma twirled with Elias in her arms, and Julian spun them both until all three collapsed into a bundle of joy on a picnic blanket. Later, as the stars began to appear one by one, they sat shoulder to shoulder, fingers laced, watching the fireflies rise like tiny blessings from the earth. Around midnight, the guests began to leave, but Julian and Emma stayed on the porch, wrapped in a quilt. Elias nestled between them, fast asleep. For a long while, they said nothing. They just listened to the crickets, to the wind, to the soft, steady breath of their child. Then Julian spoke, voice low. "We did it." Emma leaned her head on his shoulder. "We're still doing it." He kissed her hair, and she smiled because she was right. Love wasn't a finish line. It was this, the doing, the choosing, over and over again. Sometime in the early hours, they moved inside. The farmhouse glowed in the dark, warm, alive, full of something quiet and holy. Emma changed into cotton pajamas. Julian carried Elias to his crib, brushing a kiss to his forehead before slipping back into bed beside her. They lay together, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. "Do you think he'll remember any of this?" she asked. Julian reached for her hand. "No," he said, "but we will." She nodded, squeezing his fingers. "I want him to grow up knowing what love looks like," she whispered. "He already does," Julian replied. "He sees it every time you look at me." That made her laugh, soft and true. And as she drifted into sleep, he watched her one last time, memorizing the rise and fall of her breath, the curve of her smile, the way peace had finally found a place to land. Outside, the moon bathed the field in silver. Inside, 3 heartbeats moved in rhythm, and somewhere between the quiet and the dawn, a new story had begun. She entered his life like someone turning on a light in a forgotten room, and he finally understood that true power didn't lie in controlling the world, but in allowing himself to be loved. Julian and Emma didn't choose the easiest path. They chose the truest, and in this love without a script, between silences and new beginnings, they built something that neither time nor fear could erase.